We will be using this recording for our M&E purposes and also to share with some of our participants who are interested in the session today but were unable to attend online. Also, as everyone is writing down their introductions, I will just give a brief introduction to the Young Feminist Wire, which is our online platform for the YFA program. And through this platform, we hope to bring together an online community of young feminist activists or young women working on gender justice and women's rights issues from around the world. The Young Feminist Wire platform publishes blog posts on different issues of young women from around the world, but also holds these online trainings and Guests on the Wire sessions to bring together young women to talk, and young women and AWID members to talk with and discuss with one another about different issues that they are facing across contexts and regions. The Guests on the Wire sessions are actually a compressed version of the e-learning sessions that we have hosted in the past, and they are meant to bring on board young feminists who have different expertise on different issues. In the past, we have held a Guests on the Wire session on multi-generational movement building, on the World Social Forum last year, and on art and activist strategies that young women have been using to combat violence against women in their own contexts. So this session today is we have put together to discuss some of the timely issues that are coming out of the CSW, which has been going on since last week, and some of the post-2015 development agendas that are discussing women's rights issues today. So having said that, I will pass the mic on to Leila, who will guide us through some of the rules of the session.
And thank you.
And please feel free to read each other's introductions.
And thank you, Javier. Hi, everyone. My name is Leila, and I'm part of the constituency and engagement team at AWID. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today in our Guests on the Wire session. And as Javier mentioned, before we start, I would like to give you a few guidelines so that it helps optimize your participation and also that of others. First of all, you can see all the participants attending the session in the participant box in the left-hand corner. And then also, it'd be great if you make sure to always mute your microphone when the facilitator or another participant is speaking. In order to unmute it, you can click on the talk button in the upper left corner of the screen. Also in the chat box, you can use it to comment, to share your thoughts, or to have a side conversation with other participants. And if you would like to say something, you can raise your hand. There's a button for that above the participant list, and it will flag to the moderator that you would like to speak. At that point, you can unmute your microphone by clicking on the talk button. Once done talking, you can turn off your microphone, again by clicking the talk button. And in the chat box, you probably saw that there were plus signs. So if you agree with something somebody's saying, you can type in plus, and if you disagree, you can type in the negative sign. We also ask you to please not use the video option, as that will slow down the connection. And last but not least, you will see that there's a whiteboard on the right-hand side, which is only for the facilitators to use at that time. So please don't click any buttons that are attached to that for the whiteboard. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can also put them in the chat box. And Now I will give the mic to my colleague, Marissa.
Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Marisa Viana. I am with AWID and I'm the manager for the Young Feminist Program, and I have been working with Hadir through the Y and also obviously managing the program, the YFA program, and it's a really great pleasure to have all of you with us today to discuss the Post-2015 and the SDGs agenda. I know it seems like a lot of different things, so we wanted to have a space that we could have a open discussion and an overview of what's going on, and just brainstorm of how we can actually engage from a feminist perspective in these spaces. So I'm really happy to have all of you here, and thank you to our speakers to join us today. Just to start, I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves very briefly. So as I said, I'm Marisa Viana. I'm one of the moderators, and you know, in the chat we also have a membership and constituency team and my YFA colleague Hadir. So I'll just ask them to briefly introduce themselves. Natalia, do you want to go next, please?
Sure. My name is Natalia Cardona. I'm the Constituency Engagement Manager. I work mainly with our members. We're really excited to have a huge component of members this morning with us. We're excited for this conversation, and we hope it's useful to you.
Hi all. As I mentioned before, I'm the Malik. I'm the YFA co-coordinator for the program, and I have also been at AWID for about 7 years, working with the YFA program.
Thanks, Hadir. Leila, do you want to reintroduce yourself? I know you already did, but maybe just a few words again.
I think Leila is supporting our second speaker to log on to the session.
Okay, great, thanks. So maybe we'll just talk briefly about our goal for the session. Hadir covered some of it, but one of, as I was saying before, is one of our hopes for the session was to have an open conversation and discussion of where we are at, and there are many different processes going on right now in parallel, and more they are coming together, or at least some of the messages from the women's rights and feminist movement we want them to be reflected not just in the Post-2015 or the SDGs or the ICPD or the CSW, but we want them to actually come out together for this whole idea of a Post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. So our hope for this session and vision would be to actually shed light on what is going on in these different processes and hear from the people who have been involved in different ways at the international level in these processes, but also connecting back to the regions and to the national levels, and hear from you of how you have been experiencing these processes, and what are your concerns and ideas of how we make this an actual meaningful process for all of us. So the challenges and the opportunities for us to engage. And we all have been, from the AWID side, we have been involved in many different spaces as well, and trying to influence, but also to learn. And our idea to have this discussion was that, well, you know, everybody knows, everybody have been probably asked to participate in a consultation, but have we actually had this discussion, had this feminist space to discuss what is actually going on and the challenges that we have. So we're really happy to have Bridget and Bhumika with us today to talk a little bit about this and to hear from all of you of how we can influence the processes. We have our agenda. Let me just move we have our agenda here. So the first part of the agenda, we would have Bridget and Bhumika doing a presentation, speaking for about 10 minutes. And doing an overview of the processes and then the opportunities for engagement. And then the part 2 would be a Q&A, where we'd be posing some questions to you, but also answering some of your questions in relationship to these processes. And And part 3 is the more substantive discussion where we can either use the chat box or the microphone to hear your questions, your concerns, and your thoughts on these processes. We're still waiting for Bhumika to join, and we had, and she was our first speaker. So, how, Hadia or Natalia, do we have an update from Bhumika?
She's just having a lot of trouble joining us, so we're trying to figure out how we can get her on. So it's going to take a few minutes, I think.
Oh, sorry, maybe I was speaking on mute. I'll speak again. I was just saying that we'll wait for Bhumika to join, but meanwhile, it would be great if Bridget could introduce herself and speak a little bit about her work and her connections to the different processes that's going on right now. And then hopefully by then, Bhumika will also be joining. She can introduce herself and we can move on with the session. Bridget, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Can you hear me? I just wanted to make sure my speakers are working. Great. Thank you so much. Please let me know if I'm speaking too low for any reason. Thank you to all of the WIRE, the Young Feminist WIRE staff and coordinators for holding the session and for asking me to join it. I'm really pleased. It's, you know, one of my personal passions really is to continually find and look for the spaces where young feminists are working in these different processes, and to try to find spaces where there could be more collaboration, and also just spaces to discuss issues and to ensure that, you know, there are these different perspectives and spaces that can be brought into the multiple processes we're working on right now. I am from the Women's Environment and Development Organization. So it says economics here, but it's environment and development. And WEDO was founded around 20 years ago around the Rio conference. I would say probably in a similar time to what we're looking at now, where there was a number of large processes that were being initiated and coming to fruition. And at the time there was a large push to make sure that there was a space for women's rights organizations and activists, etc., to have an input into the first Rio Earth Summit. And you know, I think what was really interesting in that space, and I've talked to a lot of people who are part of that movement, was that women's groups and women's rights organizers who were there were really pushing an incredibly progressive agenda. It was sort of making sure that there was standalone recognition of women's human rights and gender equality issues. It was pushing along the linkages of all of the different issues from you know, sexual and reproductive health and rights to demilitarization and nuclear energy. I think that there was a large push to really make the linkages between all of these different spaces, and that was the space in which WEDO was founded and continued to work then for the next 20 years, really trying to organize women's caucuses in the different international processes, keeping an eye where you know, where the decisions were being taken, and also pushing for women's leadership and participation in the different processes. And for the last, I'd say 5 or 6 years or so, we have been very focused on the climate change negotiations, as well as the follow-up to Rio +20, and working with multiple groups around those different spaces. And I think for myself, the last 2, I guess it's 3 years now, has been a pretty incredible journey of what was, for example, working with the women's major group for Rio +20. Started out with a group of 30 or so, really environment focused, I would say. NGOs to then growing to 200 or 300 organizations working together to push a progressive agenda at the Rio conference, which has now spawned itself into many different collectives and groups working around what I would say is a chaotic and both a great opportunity as well as just a very chaotic landscape, a policy landscape over the next 2 years. So that's sort of where I'm coming from in terms of our work. Is at least in the last year we've been very actively engaged in the process of the development of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Post-2015 Development Agenda as a whole, as well as continuing our work in the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Agreement, which is also, of course, in 2015, trying to sign on a new agreement on climate change. So that's my introduction for now. And I do hope that Bhumika can get on, because I have to admit that I was planning a lot of the building on her input kind of presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. We're actually just trying to get on the phone.
Hadir, we can't hear you. You're too far away from the mic.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, is this better? Hello?
Yes, we hear you now.
Yeah, I was just saying that Marissa's just a bit busy getting Bhumika online on the phone to get her online. Hopefully she'll be able to join us, because she's an excellent speaker on highlighting the issues that we're talking about today. But maybe as we're waiting for to hear on Bhumika's situation, I was wondering if we could go back a little bit to the introductions where a lot of people have introduced themselves, but we haven't talked much about, what are impressions of the post-2015 development agenda when it comes to women's rights right now. Okay, I see that some people are having a hard time hearing me. I will try to speak a little bit louder. I was saying, while we are waiting for Bhumika to join us online, and hopefully it will allow us to, and hopefully she will be able to join us, we could go back to the discussion on, sharing a little bit about our impressions of the post-2015 development agenda when it comes to women's rights, and how everyone is envisioning that women's rights agendas are going to be taken up. I think Bridget had shared some of her impressions, and Lori was saying, I'm just scrolling up on the chat box, but Bridget was saying that she thinks it's an amazing opportunity to reframe development, saying that there is much stagnation retention rather than transformative agenda. Sure, Bridget, go ahead.
Thanks. I think this could be a good sort of segue, and while we wait for Bhumika, I'd be interested to hear other people's impressions too. I guess my sense is that there are so many different processes that are coming to a head, if you will, in the next year or 2 years, and particularly this year. I think a lot of the words are being put on paper, and there's so many people working on these issues, but what we're really seeing is, I would say, for the last year or 2 years, people were pushing for a very strong transformative agenda, with human rights as central to that. And from the CSW to the SDGs to in the UN spaces that we've been working in, there's a real sort of pushback and a rollback, and we saw this in Rio as well, of where we're not necessarily fighting for progress, but really fighting for retention or for non-retrogression, which is a real it's a real struggle to figure out how we build on this great opportunity to set a more transformative agenda for the next however many years for development. And we know that, and I know that AWID has done a lot of work on this to showcase how these goals and how this agenda, for example, will really set the kind of where financing and priorities, et cetera, will go. So, my overall impression is that and I don't necessarily have the solution to it, but that we're not really in conversations about thinking about transformation to the kind of paradigms that have led to the vast inequalities that we see now, but really more a retention and I would say almost a co-optation of some of the language that over the past 2 years progressive civil society movements have been using in terms of transformation. So we get a lot of reports now which use that word, but don't kind of talk about macroeconomic change, for example. So I think that there's a lot of challenges. I don't think that they're not insurmountable and that we couldn't still achieve. I think this is the space where these conversations are happening, unfortunately, as imperfect as it might be. So that's just my overall impression. I'd be interested to hear what others are thinking.
Great. Thank you, Bridget, for elaborating. Does anyone want to respond to some of the points that Bridget has brought up or add in their own 2 cents about their impression?
I think Hadir said, thank you, Bridget, and would anybody like to respond to what Bridget has brought up? And if you have any other questions or comments, and just an update, we're working to get Bhumika here as fast as we can. She's having a lot of technical problems, but if you have any questions that you might want to bring up, it would be great if you could do that now. And Hadir is about to join us. She finally is able to join Blackboard. So, if you have any questions, it would be great if you can bring those up right now. You can put your hand up as Leila had suggested, or you can type in the chat box if you're shy. Marisa, I had wondered if you might have some additions to the conversation as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to figure out what would be the best way to get Mika also, but I'm glad that she's gonna be able to join through the Blackboard. Yeah, so from my side, I agree with a lot of the comments the Bridget shared, and I was hoping to save some of this more for the discussion part, but just my overall impression is exactly, I think just one is the whole human rights language being co-opted with governments and from corporations also, who have not only the human rights language but the UN spaces where all of these negotiations or most of these negotiations are happening. And we see that they're more and more just visibly, like physically speaking on panels on human rights and using that language. And one of the things that really struck me a couple of months ago was this on the Open Working Group 6, and we'll go over a little bit over this. I know it sounds like jargon and just terms that we don't really know if you haven't heard about it before. But during the Open Working Group 6, which is discussed the Sustainable Development Agenda, there was this guy making a presentation with this approach to human rights and to what sustainable development would look like. And he basically was describing this the whole human rights framework as a supermarket where you could pick and choose what governments wanted to implement or to prioritize. So you have, if you wanted to just focus on education, you would do that, or if you want to focus on health, you would do that. And it's just for us and for us who are working to really get a comprehensive human rights-based approach agenda, we don't want to pick and choose. That's not something, how do you pick food over education? And obviously would pick food, but what about the education aspect of it? So it's just really interesting of how some people are being very creative, but not really holistic on the approach of what does a human rights-based approach, focus that's people-centered, that's based on justice and equality, it looks like. So I think just my first impression is how do we really continue to advocate for a human rights-based approach, but that we get the government and the other allies to hear what that means. And I think at the halls of the UN, sometimes that's really difficult to get across. And it's a little bit sad that we are in the situation where we keep trying to convince governments and the UN as an agency to put human rights at the center of development. But it seems like Bhumika was able to join us, so I'll stop talking and I'll ask Bhumika to introduce herself, and then we'll go over the questions. Bhumika, welcome. Sorry that you had so much trouble in joining us today, so it would be great if you can introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your work with us. Bhumika, if you are there, you have to press the talk button so that you can speak. See if that works. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Finally, yay! Welcome.
Okay, so do I have to keep pressing the talk button to be audible?
If you press on it once, it should stay audible.
Ah, fantastic. Okay.
Okay, so we're excited to have you, and we're hoping that you can just dive into your presentation to give us an overview of the post-2015 agenda, and we can go from there. Bridget went before you because we were waiting on you, and Marisa did a little bit of an overview as well, but we were trying to wait for you so that you could do the major part of it.
Okay, sure. Let's see. So should I just go into the questions that were outlined for me, right?
Can you introduce, we was wondering if you can introduce yourself, just briefly talk a little bit about yourself and your work and your engagement with the whole post-2015 processes, and then we can go into the questions.
Sure. Okay. My name is Bhumika Muchhala. I work for an organization called Third World Network. We are based in several developing countries, Malaysia, India, Indonesia, Philippines, but we also have a policy office in Geneva. What we do is we work with developing country governments and negotiators, and also with social movements, and we're sort of their interlocutors, the liaison, bridging this very important gap, making sure that the messages from the grassroots, the priorities of people get through to the negotiators that are actually making decisions and at the forefront of global decision making. So in the UN, we've been working on the sustainable development and post-2015 processes over the last many years. We were at the Rio +20 conference in Brazil, and we were tracking the entire process from before it began in 2011 onward. What happened in 2012 was the Sustainable Development Goals was born, and we didn't realize it then, but the Sustainable Development Goals has taken a lead role in paving the path for post-2015, and the two are quite enmeshed now. So what I do here in New York is I work with the developing country government negotiators, and I also work with civil society globally, and we are trying to push for development-oriented progressive positions to the government, and there's a there's a particular set of principles that we're looking at that come from the Rio Principles of 1992 to push forward in articulating the post-2015 development agenda. We're really concerned about human rights, women's rights. We're also concerned about the means of implementation, which means that this entire post-2015 will actually make sense for countries in the South and not just impose new and additional obligations or conditionalities on them. So we're looking at a couple of different arenas and how to make sure that the post-2015 development agenda is actually about development and not something else. Were you able to hear me at all?
Yes, we can hear you. Most people usually stay on silent unless you put a question to them, and they can also use the chat box as well. But it's interesting, Bhumika, what you were saying about it not being about development at all. So what else could it be about? Maybe you can dive a little bit into that.
Right, okay. So, you know, there's a couple of concerns that the international civil society and grassroots organizations, social movements have about the post-2015 development agenda. So the reason why this is important is because the Millennium Development Goals was a very top-down process, right? It was not negotiated by governments. It was basically written up there in the Secretary General's office on the 38th floor of the Secretariat building. It was written by a bunch of technocrats, not just in the United Nations, but also from the United States, the State Department, or the Foreign Service Department. And it was written by people from the OECD, the World Bank. It was technocrat crafting. And it was very undemocratic in the way in which it was decided upon. There's been many, many critiques of the Millennium Development Goals, which many of you might have already heard, the fact that it doesn't really address development, that it's band-aids, a quick fix medicine that works only temporarily and on the surface. It doesn't address the root causes of poverty and development. It doesn't address a meaningful system that includes actual reforms and changes to the global political economy. It doesn't even address the ways in which poor countries are locked into poverty structurally, into a cycle of poverty and dependency, whereas rich countries are able to consolidate power, capital, technology, access. So the MDGs is seen as sort of a slap-on ad hoc agenda. It just addresses, okay, these ad hoc goals that are not universal, they're only for developing countries. And this is the blueprint upon which aid has been based on. It's been based on this very narrow blueprint of, oh, increase education by this much, and decrease maternal mortality by this much, and increase access to health by this much. But it doesn't address what are the actual reasons why developing countries cannot, finance more, money to their health sector? What are the actual reasons why they cannot increase and strengthen their education sector? What are the actual reasons why they cannot create more jobs? This isn't, we're not, the global economy that we live in is not one in which countries can decide to do something on their own and then do it. They're in a global political economy where there are many international constraints and factors that inhibit, that constrain, that literally don't allow developing countries to pursue economic and social development. Primarily the fact that developing country budgets are much smaller and they're not able to invest enough money into their economic sectors. Secondly, because of a larger structure of export-oriented development model, which at the very base of that export-oriented development model, which comes into development economics, which of course the MDGs don't address, is that countries need to create industries in order to create jobs, in order to create wages, in order to grow the economy, in order to finance social development. These are all interlinked. A country that doesn't create enough industry, enough economic activity, enough jobs, enough wages, will not be able to do other things as well. These are all interlinked and connected. And so the MDG agenda doesn't address this. And the hope is that the post-2015 development agenda can address a system where it's not just the South developing countries that have to do things, but the developed countries also have to do things that address the interlinkages, that address the actual reasons why we have such inequality between different countries. What does this mean? This means that we want the post-2015 development agenda to address things like finance and trade and debt and the export-oriented development model, the race to the bottom with corporate globalization. And this is very much, all of these are housed within something called the Global Partnership for Development. In the Millennium Development Goals, it was called Goal 8. And this Global Partnership for Development has been acknowledged far and wide as having failed to really address the underlying systemic root causes for economic development. And so that's the one thing we're hoping the post-2015 development agenda will do differently, is that it will address things for the developed countries to do as well, and that this will be different from what it requires of developing countries, and that it will really take into acknowledgement this global partnership for development.
Thanks, Bhumika. This is a great segue. You're already going through like why do we need a post-2015 development framework. I was wondering if you could speak, we were hoping that you could deconstruct a little bit what is going on with the different processes. So if you could address the first question that you're posing here, what is the UN post-2015 development agenda, and how is the process linked to the MDGs, to the SDGs, and then to the finance committee as you're speaking before, that's coming out of Rio +20. Can you just maybe deconstruct that a little bit for us, for those who haven't really been following this agenda very closely? Then we can go more into discussion, but this is a great overview of what is going on and why do we need to engage in the post-2015 development framework.
Sure, yeah. Well, just to sort of cap off the the key point of the earlier conversation is that the reason why this is important is because aid money that flows from rich countries to poor countries, the aid money that comes from developed to developing countries, is usually based on a system of thinking. And the Millennium Development Goals has been the paradigm upon which this aid money has been based. So when the aid is given to a developing country, it's, around the parameters and the goals and the objectives set by the Millennium Development Goals. So we want the money that flows from developed to developing countries to be based on something substantial, to be based on an authentic development agenda, not these sort of ad hoc requirements that don't address the underlying root causes and thus don't achieve the objective. So that's why this is important, right? So post-2015, in 2015, the Millennium Development Goals will expire, and there's going to be a new framework in place. So there's been an entire production, there's been an entire system, it's a massive sort of international, hydra-headed, production that is taking place that is very complex because it involves so many countries, so many different UN agencies, the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, national development agencies. Just about everyone is involved in this production, but the UN is the lead of it. So there's something called the UN Task Team, which has been a consortium of UN agencies. There's also the Rio +20 follow-up, which has created the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's going to be linked to the post-2015 development agenda. It's not that the Sustainable Development Goals will become the post-2015 development agenda, but it's going to be linked. There's many different theories out there. One theory is that the post-2015 development agenda is basically going to be the Sustainable Development Goals with a declaration, a political declaration, or a narrative, or a, some sort of a outcome document or a treaty as such. Another possibility is that the Sustainable Development Goals is going to be a separate entity from the post-2015 development agenda. And the post-2015 will take into consideration and will refer to the SDGs. So there's a couple of different possibilities right now. And the reason why it's distinct is because what's been happening so far is the Sustainable Development Goals, the crafting, the making of the Sustainable Development Goals. The post-2015 will start after the General Assembly sessions this September 2014. So we need to remember they are distinct. There's a lot of confusion out there. That one, overriding confusion is that they're the same thing. So people refer to SDGs being post-2015. That isn't actually true. They are distinct, but we don't know the ways in which they will be connected. Are they going to be slapped onto each other, or are they going to be connected in a different way? So the SDGs we can think of as a sort of a 2.5-headed body or something like that. So the reason why it has 2.5 heads is because the first main entity is called the Open Working Group. The Open Working Group was decided upon in the Rio +20 conference in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and it is made up of 30 members. Some of the members are groups of 3 countries. Some of the members are just 1 country. For example, Argentina, Ecuador, and Bolivia is one group. India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan is one group. Indonesia, Kazakhstan, and China is one group. But Brazil and Nicaragua are 2 countries, and that's another group. Benin is 1 country, and it's its own group. Ghana is 1 country, it's its own group. The UK, the Netherlands, and I think Ireland is 1 group. The US, Israel, and Canada is 1 group. So it's a body called the Open Working Group, and they've had now 9 sessions. 9 sessions that are anywhere between 3 days to 5 days from March 2013 to last week. And every session they discuss different issues. What they've come up with so far is something called the Focus Areas document, which outlines 19 different areas that the Sustainable Development Goals will address. These 19 areas are really far-reaching. They cover a lot of different things, actually, from sustainable consumption and production to peace and conflict. They cover a lot of different issues. So this focus areas document has been coming into play. Like the last session from March 3rd to 5th, you had all the different governments comment on this focus areas document. What is missing, what needs to be integrated, what is good, what is bad. So there were some things that were pointed out as some really good things. There were some things pointed out as bad things. So there's been an entire analysis that's taken place between the developed countries and the developing countries. They have some very different takes. In particular, some of the main debate points or some of the main differences emerging is that developing countries keep insisting that you may have universal goals, but you have different goals. So one of the things they say is universal goals, but differentiated roles. So what that means is they want the SDGs to apply to both North and South, to all levels of development, to the richest countries, the poorest countries, but they're absolutely vigorously, arguing, repeatedly arguing that the roles and responsibilities in the implementation of these goals should be differentiated with respect to the different national realities, capacities, and levels of development of countries. So what they're basically saying is that the UK and Ghana should not be expected to implement the Sustainable Development Goals to the same degree. So you may have universal goals, for example, sustainable consumption and production, but the targets within that should be extremely respectful of the huge difference between the capacity of the UK and the capacity of Ghana, right? So this is what connects to what developing countries keep calling for is Rio Principle number 7. The Rio Principle is actually a legal document from 1992, and the 7th principle in that document is called Common but Differentiated Responsibility. And Common but Differentiated Responsibility talks about this, that there should be different roles and responsibilities as per different levels of development, different capacities, different national realities. Now, the developed countries do not want to talk about this. They keep saying that Common but Differentiated Responsibility, otherwise known as CBDR, is only for climate change. It's only for environment. It's only relevant to environment and climate change commitments and goals. So this is where a big fight is coming across, because developing countries are saying, no, it relates to everything. It applies to everything. And the developed countries are saying it only relates to environment. Developing countries are also unanimously calling for means of implementation, which means the actual tools to make SDGs happen. They want it both as a standalone goal, which the document currently addresses, but they also want it to be integrated across all of the 19 goals, because they keep emphasizing that the concept of means of implementation embodies not just financial resources to actually get the goals happening, but also technological development, technology transfer, capacity building, and structural reforms in the larger international financial system. So these are some of the major differences. And of course, I mentioned, Global Partnership for Development. So the developing countries are calling for this to be its own goal, that there should be a standalone, goal in its own integrity for Global Partnership for Development. And in fact, they're saying this should not just be a goal, but it should be the overarching framework to create that environment, to make the conditions happen for sustainable development. In the UN, they use the language called enabling international environment for development. We need an enabling international environment for any of these things to make sense. So, as usual, what it comes down to in the UN is a debate on political economy. But this debate is really important because you go to the World Bank, you go to the IMF, this debate is not happening. In the World Bank and IMF, it's very clear who are the rulers and who are the subjects. But at least in the UN, where each country has its own voice, unlike the World Bank and IMF, where developing countries don't have a voice, in the UN, at least we can have this debate about political economy, because just about everything in the world comes down to political economy. It comes down to power, it comes down to patriarchy, it comes down to history, a history of colonization, hundreds of years that shape the world we live in today, that if we're going to address aid, development, United Nations, it has to address the history that the world's nations are coming from. And so when we talk about these debates in the UN, we need to contextualize it in that history, and that's how it makes sense.
Great, thanks, Bhumika. This is really amazing to hear you and to just understand a little bit more of the many different dynamics that we have with these different processes, and also just to hear most of the concerns. The 19 priorities are out, and what we should be expecting to see going ahead. I think there's a lot of different questions that people want to ask, and I'm just going to ask, if you do have questions, maybe you can hold on to them or type it here, and then we can go over them at the Q&A that Bhumika and Bridget can address. I wanted to ask if Bridget wanted to comment on anything that Bhumika has said, but also to go into the questions that we had for her, which given this the overview that Bhumika gave us and the challenges, how our women's rights organizations engage in different spaces, and what is the political, how can women's rights advocates engage with this process, how they have been engaged, and talk a little bit what is going on from the civil society aspect of it. But also to give her the floor to comment on anything Bhumika has said, or to add to Bhumika's points.
Thank you so much, Marissa. I'm so glad that Bhumika was able to get on, and that's why I wanted to wait for her to have the chance to talk, because I've heard her many times before, and she has a great way of laying things out. Very, very complex and complicated processes to very understandable, I think, in a very understandable manner. So, I mean, it would just, the real comment would be, and this is maybe a question, and I know Bhumika can speak to it, and I'd be interested in it, coming up is this challenge that we're facing really with the principle of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibility, the impetus and the need to fight for, you know, sort of this conflation that we're seeing coming out on the right to development versus the insurance of human rights. If there is one, not that, you know, but that is politically coming out in some of these discussions. So it would be great to get your sense. I know you've said some things about this before. It would be great for that to come up in terms of the discussion point after this. I guess I would just say, in terms of how are women's rights organizations and activists in general trying to engage in these multiple processes. I think, as Bhumika laid out, you know, there was the SDG process, which came out of Rio +20, and then this Post-2015 development agenda. It's not been clear from the beginning how these would be related, and I would say the last 2 years have been really trying to figure out where the entry points were going to be. You know, it wasn't clear how this process would be taken forward, but it was clear that people wanted it to be completely different from the way that the Millennium Development Goals were put together, which, as Bhumika explained, was extremely top-down. So, you know, in terms of what the spaces are, there are multiple groups of organizations and individuals that are coming at this from either the specific process that they've been involved in or the groups that they've been involved in. I know I spoke briefly about the Women's Major Group, which was, you know, the history of that was really that it was the major group around the CSD, the Commission on Sustainable Development, which met sort of regularly each year in a similar fashion to the CSW. And this is a really small group of organizations who are following on from Rio back in the 90s. So that small group of individuals come time for Rio +20 really, as I said, burgeoned into 200 or 300 organizations. And I do think that Rio was an opportunity to start organizing collectively again. And there was so much work done around the Rio +20 process that when the SDGs came out of this and we knew there would be an open working group process, immediately there was a lot of sort of, amidst some stumbling and fumbling around to try to figure out what these linkages to the overall post-2015 development agenda would be, was to bring these 500 or so organizations and groups that have been working on at the Rio process and in the Rio process to working around the open working group for the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. And as Bhumika said, we had 8 open working groups that were defined by several themes at each of them, and at each of them we had a spot for the Women's Major Group, enabling interventions and statements. There was a lot of coordination for each of these meetings and each of these themes, the development of statements and fact sheets, etc. And that model, you know, is something that model of caucus building or bringing together this kind of constituency, at least in many of the processes that we do work in, that's our experience of all of these processes. So in the CSW, for example, we do, and AWID and a number of organizations are co-coordinating a women's rights caucus. So this is the space, again, where individual activists and groups who are coming to the CSW can sit together, can strategize, advocate which governments need to be talked to, can try, although there's not often enough space, can try to discern these huge questions that are coming out, what the big picture stumbling blocks are between you know, what we can push for in terms of language versus what we need to do to really see transformative change. And then in, for example, the climate change negotiation, we have another constituency like major group system. And you'll see this in all of the UN processes, that there are systems, some more advanced than others, for civil society participation, which really push the organization of civil society onto civil society themselves by giving them one slot to talk about women's issues, etc., which we've fought for a very long time, to have these space for civil society. So in the UNFCCC, for example, there's a women and gender constituency which does similar things. And I think the issue now is really, how do we outlined, Bhumika outlined the process for what's going to happen with the open working group. There's several more meetings now for them to drill down these focus areas into what is presumably going to be the SDGs, which will then be presented and discussed in the General Assembly, and we're waiting to see what the outcome of that will be. But we're also talking about, in the ICPD is doing the Beyond 2014 review. This is the International Year of the Small Island Developing States. There's an Indigenous People Forum in September around the General Assembly, which they've been preparing for 10 years or so. The Hyogo Framework for Action on Disasters is also going to be coming out with a new agenda for 2015. And then, very particular close to WEDO's heart is that the climate change negotiations are looking to sign a new agreement in 2015. And what's not unbelievable is that this crux of an argument, this crux of an issue of who is basically responsible for development, this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. It is, of course, and has always been an issue in the climate and environment spaces, but it is now being one of the main crucial points in all of these discussions. And so, a lot of what women's rights organizers and activists, I think for maybe a few years now, we've been working sort of siloed in these different processes, and I definitely see in this year in particular, there is a need for trying to bridge those processes together. There's so many of us working in so many different ones, so bridging them to have some concise strategy points to both really understand, because it's hard to come into these processes if we don't understand the overarching political economy issues that are happening in the space. So we have to be able to contextualize that and understand that in each of these different spaces to be able to strategically push for a common goal, I would think. So I think that is a challenge for advocates and organizations. It's a challenge to stretch very limited capacity, and I think it's an amazing opportunity. And we can, if there's so many alongside each of these different processes, there's so many ideas of how activists can be involved or can set their agenda. I was just at the UNFCCC meeting last week, where there's going to be a large climate summit in 2014 in September, which many groups are challenging in terms of the framing, but also trying to figure out, this is the last moment that heads of state are going to be together discussing an issue like climate change, and how can we use that as a moment to push a progressive, transformative agenda on a new development paradigm, for example. And there's lots of discussion in different groups around how do we have a sort of global campaign. And I know that there's also this is supposed to be the year of the social cost, where we're taking all the inputs going into the climate change negotiations, but also feeding them into the SDGs and into the Post-2015, etc. agenda. So, I mean, I'm outlaying what is a very complicated sort of area, but I do think that there is probably a way that we can be more considerate in how we are working together to not merge the processes, but to strategize on what the main issues are that are cutting across all of them. And just as a comment really briefly, and I think we can go into questions then on this challenge of, so how do you go from a completely top-down development agenda to a bottom-up participatory agenda? And I think there's been a lot of work, if you will, done by the UN to to try to build in a more consultative process. But I would definitely challenge what that consultation actually looks like, because, and this was brought up really briefly, but for example, one of the ways that this consultation was done was the creation of this global survey, if you will, called My World, which was essentially developed to ask people around the world to prioritize their rights off, to prioritize what is most important to them. Is it food? Is it equality between men and women? Is it education, etc.? And this was promoted, and it was really pushed through youth activists, I would say, because I still think that there is this sense that in mobilizing consultation, it needs to make use of technology, which of course it does, but I think that making use of technology and oversimplifying really complex challenges don't need to be mutually exclusive. So, this My World survey was just one example of, I would say, a sort of dumbing down of a really complex development agenda and then forcing people to, basically prioritize whether they would like food or equality. And so I think there was huge challenges to that, and I think the issue is that these do have an influence in terms of deciding on what the agenda is going to be. And of course, in that kind of space, you don't see these larger issues which drive the inequalities that Bhumika laid out in terms of trade and macroeconomic financial flows, for example. That is not included in these. So, I think that while we are discussing how people can get involved, it would be interesting to also hear or think about, given that this is the Young Feminist Wire, how, what is young youth participation in this process? Is it being co-opted or tokenized, and what does it actually mean, and how can we make sure that we have a space in this process and that we are able to participate meaningfully? That would be my final point before moving on to discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Bridget. Yeah, it's good timing, because they'll give us a little bit, about 20 minutes or so for discussions, and we already have a few questions. So if you, let me see, sorry, someone had a question before, so if you want to raise your question now, do you want to use the talk button to raise your questions, or type your question again? I know you typed it, just can't find it, sorry about that. But still, feel free to speak just by pressing the talking button. Yeah, I think Elizabeth had a question. Do you want to raise it now? Hi, Elizabeth. Please go ahead. So if you're not speaking, it'd be great if you can mute your mic. You just press the talk button. So if it's not highlighted in blue, then you should be muted.
Hello. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering about, my question was to Bhumika. I was wondering about how this different approach between developing countries and developed countries apply from the perspective of women's rights, because I perfectly understand what developing countries mean when they say that responsibility should be common but differentiated according to the context. But of course, it might have consequences concerning women issues, particularly about SRHR, but also in general. So I was wondering about these aspects, about how this different approach can influence the implementation of women women's rights, the protection of women's rights in the framework of the development goals. I hope that my question was clear.
Should I go ahead and answer the question now? Should we just, or should we take more questions?
Go ahead and answer the question. And
yeah, is that Elizabeth? I'm not getting the name right. Is that Elizabeth?
Yes, that's Elizabeth.
Okay. No, that's a fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking it. And in fact, as I was speaking, I was thinking I'm speaking, in a very specific arena of women's rights activists, and I am not necessarily. I very much apologize for not doing a good enough job of. I'm not doing a good enough job of connecting women's rights to someone with country responsibility and the means of implementation.
Bhumika, sorry to interrupt you. We're having a hard time hearing you. Maybe you want to get a little closer to the mic. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Kind of. A little bit, but it's still very fuzzy. Anyway, try your best, and I'll try typing your words into the chat box.
I wonder if it would help if I brought up my speaker headphones. I'm not sure if that would help, but I'm just going to hold it close to me. Can you hear better now? Is it still fuzzy?
Better now.
Okay. Better. Well, no, I was just going to basically highlight that it's extremely relevant, your question. And what we have with the governments right now is a situation that was, to be honest, quite predictable, that gender equality and women's empowerment is mentioned. It's very important to be specific about what is mentioned, and what is mentioned is gender equality and women's empowerment. We all know that gender equality and women's empowerment talk about, so in focus area 5, the 5th goal is listed exactly as gender equality and women's empowerment. And these words are extremely important because gender equality and women's empowerment, we know, is not the same thing as women's rights. It's not at all the same thing. And when we're talking about the rights discourse, when we talk about rights, it becomes a terrain that is much more controversial, because in the General Assembly there is a hesitation, or there is a lack of consensus. Let's say there's a lack of consensus on prioritizing women's rights and human rights, for that matter. And this sensitivity, or this ambivalence, let's say, towards mentioning rights is a very old issue. It goes back to many different concerns over many decades, primarily from developing countries. But we need to recognize that many of the developing countries are not comfortable. This is an arena where, the north-south kind of dynamic is flipped around. It's flipped around 180 degrees, where the developed countries are more willing and open to address the word rights. The developing countries are not as willing to address the word rights. Because we know that gender equality and women's empowerment is not the same thing as women's rights. Women's rights is much more definitive. It has precedent texts such as CEDAW and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It connects to legal clauses and the issue of law and enforcement and a judicial process, and refers to a much more constitutional basis for the rights of women, not just gender equality, which is not as powerful and is not as expansive in scope, because gender equality refers to the difference between men and women, and not necessarily even to a larger picture of gender, right? And that it's not just necessarily equality, but it's rights, which is a very different thing from equality vis-a-vis closing the income pay gap or you know, having the same access to services, because a lot of the women's rights discourse, as we all know, is not necessarily about equal and same, but rather about the specificity of women's rights taking on its own its own contours, its own needs, as specific to, you know, different sections of women. We don't want to essentialize women either. You know, there's class, there's ethnicity, there's you know, all sorts of variations that must be respected, and that kind of nuance we are not seeing in the UN process. That kind of nuance is completely lost. So the language of women's rights still has a long way to go. It's its own goal in Focus Area 5. It's not integrated into education, health, food security, energy, economic growth, industrialization. They don't necessarily recognize that things like women's rights, human rights, is across the board, and that any kind of development mandate that doesn't address rights is useless, because we've seen what happens when, you know, countries are able to gain economic growth and higher rates of GDP, but it doesn't filter into, it doesn't translate into equitable development for all.
Thanks, Bhumika. I just wanted to add, and I think it's also a question to all of you and to Bhumika and Bridget to hear your perspective also. But as you know, right now we are in the middle of the CSW, the Commission on Status of Women, in the second week of negotiations, and one of the issues that has come up and goes to this specific issue of rights to development, common but differentiated responsibilities, and women's rights. And one of and what is going on now is that the northern countries are very resistant to, not very, but resistant to the term rights to development, and I'm assuming it's linked to the common but differentiated responsibilities, and the southern developing countries, you know, using that. So the discussion, I guess, is like, in summary, is this trade between, you know, the developed countries hold on to the women's rights and, you know, very vocal in terms of advocating for that, women's rights and women's human rights, and then developing countries are holding on to the need to the rights development and how that's women's rights. But what is happening with the dynamic within the CSW now is that what is being traded here, on one side you have government saying that, you know, women's rights are really important, and then the other side saying rights development is really important. So it's just like this geopolitical dynamics that's going on, where things any minute can be traded, but you have these both sides. You know, how do you engage with that, where you have governments who are very strong on women's rights, and then other governments who are using that to say, well, we need the rights to development, and the right to development are essentially women's rights. So I just want to hear your perspective on that, on sort of that broad issue of rights to development, women's rights, and common but differentiated responsibilities, and how governments use that as bargaining chips.
Marissa, was that a question posed to us or to the participants overall?
I mean, it was just a comment, and along with that, also a question. And it would be great to hear comments, since you have a way more experience with the common but differentiated responsibilities linked to development, and just making this linkage now to what is going on with the CSW. So it would be great to hear Bhumika, your opinion on this, but also hear from others in the room.
Sure. Well, I can just do a quick input, because Marissa, what you raised with regard to what I personally often call the horse trade between right to development and women's rights and human rights, is it's an old game. It's an old intergovernmental negotiation game. It's been in play for I don't know. I mean, a long time, and it's there's no way to legitimize it. This is something that I've never, Third World Network does not support this. We don't support this kind of horse trade. They're not interchangeable. The right to development is important in its own right, and so is human rights and women's rights. It's not a horse trade. It's not you give us this and we'll give you that. They're both important to address. Meanwhile, it's complicated, right? We can understand the perspective of developing countries who are saying, you want to talk about human rights? You want to talk about women's rights? Well, let's talk about rights to development first. And to a certain extent, we can understand that. But again, to another extent, it's not a quid pro quo. It's not a horse trade. Well, you give me mine, and I'll give you yours, and we're going to hand it over to each other at the same time. It doesn't necessarily work like that. This is what intergovernmental negotiations comes down to. It's a dialogue. It's a negotiation. You know, the main point being that this is not a legitimate kind of trade. We need to look at ways in which negotiations can open the space to strengthen the political will of the developed countries to talk about the right to development. And by right to development, we are talking directly about the Global Partnership for Development, the systemic reforms, macroeconomics, finance, trade, the aid architecture. The right to development, what kinds of policies and international rules do not allow developing countries to develop. At the same time, developing countries have to show the political will and the commitment to address human rights and women's rights. And they cannot keep using and this is something they have always used, they cannot keep using the sort of hands up in the air tactic of, oh no, we don't want to talk about human rights because that's going to translate into additional obligations and commitments from us. Human rights means more commitments, more conditionality, more obligations from us. They want something from us. If we allow discussion about human rights, they're going to ask something from us. We're not going to give anything because we're not getting anything. So it's like a chess game where neither side budges, and it's a sort of a standoff. This is one of the key areas where you see between North and South a standoff. And it comes into play across different negotiations, across different processes. The Commission on the Status of Women, the Rio Post-20 follow-up, Post-2015, what have you. All climate change, you have the same thread running as a consistent narrative or a consistent sort of back and forth dialectic in all these different spaces.
Hey, Bhumika, there's a couple of questions in the chat box. And some people are asking, how do we take the political negotiation out of the discussion? And others are asking, how do we go beyond this horse trade to ensure that women's rights are not put under the radar? Maybe you and Bridget could take a stab at that.
Can I just, I had a similar question, and it's not so much a question because I don't think, I mean maybe she does, but I don't think Bhumika or anyone has a perfect answer, because that is the actual challenge. You know, is how do you, my feeling in, for example, the UN SDGs discussions that I was in last week, which were a discussion from 10 years ago, basically, and what you're trying in those negotiations on climate change, what's happening is that people have agreed that whatever we do, whatever action we take on climate change has to be applicable to all. But it was a conversation of, we didn't cause this, so you have to do it. And where I think it's really interesting is that there's no, you know, if you're talking about, these are spaces for negotiation. And if anybody studies negotiations, you know, if there is no trust in the room, if there's no trust between the parties that are negotiating, you cannot possibly come to some sort of outcome. And I think this is really where the failing of the MDG on global partnership is evident, because we're still stuck from 20 years ago in a space where we see ourselves as a completely divided world between, you know, haves and have-nots, because we are. And, you know, and I think it's crucially imperative to keep pointing to, people often don't look at or don't think about this piece on global partnership. What does it look like? How can we continue to be stalled in a negotiation around whose fault, who has to basically jump first, when there are countries whose whose existence is actually at stake, or when there are spaces where every day people are living in extreme poverty, etc. So I think it's a question, and in some of these spaces you see that there are countries breaking out of these groupings, trying to kind of mold conversation, bring it a little bit forward. I think part of the answer is highlighting and championing those countries. I think part of it is actual mobilization at the national level, again, to put some of these things back on the agenda. And I think a final piece of it is not dumbing down the complexity of it. It's not going into countries and saying you have to choose between which rights that you want, but really outlaying these are the challenges to an enabling environment for development, if you will, enabling international environment for development, and getting that education out, to people to bring that into these discussions. But Bhumika, maybe you do have the perfect answer.
No, that's exactly what I would be saying as well. We're on the same page with that, absolutely. But just in terms of, I'm looking at the chat box right now, and I just wanted to point out, or just to clarify, there was one particular chat right now that says, is it then up to CSOs to keep up the pressure on the distinction between the right to development and women's rights? No, CSOs should not be doing that, because the distinction is exactly what the problem is. CSOs, I feel, it's a responsibility of civil society to, yes, I'm going to go to Nellie's question, to go beyond this forced trade, to be the wiser, more mature force of articulating the fact that both the right to development and women's and human rights are legitimate and important and urgent to address by both developed and developing countries, right? I mean, it's our job to cross this north-south binary black and whiteness and to assert that both are important and that both are so deeply interlinked. I mean, that's, I think, the next step. The next step is to really articulate that even if developing countries are provided with an expanded and stronger right to development, what good is that without human rights and women's rights integrated into the right to development? Because development is first and foremost about meeting rights. And this is where I think there is a huge semantic misunderstanding in the United Nations. When civil society talks about human rights and women's rights, we're talking about economic and social rights. We're talking about dignity. We're talking about access. We're talking about inclusivity, participation. We're talking about voice. We're talking about the right to food, the right to security, the right to a job, the right to a meaningful life, the right to expanded opportunities, and being able to realize our dreams, right? We're talking about sort of these larger visions of development when we're talking about rights. Here's the problem. That's what we're talking about. That's what civil society is talking about when they say a rights-based development framework. The problem is this, that oftentimes on the political space, human rights translates into the transgression of the state into minority and vulnerable communities. And it translates into human rights being used as a carrot and stick in the foreign policy of the developed countries. And in a very real way, what it translates to in the political space of the UN is Afghanistan and Iraq and East Timor and the Congo and civil wars, right? And so this is where I think this is one of the biggest challenges that developing countries see. The women's rights and human rights, as soon as we talk about rights, they get the jitters. They get the jitters about economic sanctions. They get just jitters about the unilateral intervention of the United States as the most powerful military empire on the planet, barging into countries left and right and doing whatever they want. Afghanistan and Iraq in the last 15 years, case in point. So this is what developing countries are fearful about. This is what they do this is their knee-jerk response to rights, to the word right. That's why the word right has a knee-jerk red light, flashlight response. So this is what we need to overcome. And this is what I'd be interested in, inspiring activists to try to really articulate a way to overcome this.
Thank you, Bhumika. We are almost out of time, so I just wanted to give a chance to the participants to raise any further questions or comments or any thoughts that they might have in regards to this discussion. We had prepared some group discussion questions here. I'm sure we won't be able to get to all of them, but it would be great to hear from the participants in terms of questions, reactions, thoughts. So the floor is open for either for chatting, writing your answers, or talking by pressing the talk button.
Yes, go ahead. There's a hand raised by John J.
John J., do you want to speak? You can use your your mic, or you can use the chat box. Please go ahead. Okay, we can't hear you. So maybe you can try typing in the chat box if you have a question.
So while we figure out the problem here, does anyone else have a question that they want to raise, a comment?
Someone's asking why we're not talking about sustainable development. Bhumika, do you want to try and answer that question? Or Marisa?
Is Bridget still there, or is she had to leave?
She had to leave, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say that we are talking about sustainable development. One of the things that is important to remember is that sustainable development is not just about environment and environmental sustainability and ecological sustainability. Sustainable development in the UN has 3 equal pillars: the economic pillar, the social pillar, and the environmental pillar. All 3 pillars coexist in equanimity. And the one of the key issues is that how can the world embark on environmental sustainability without having the economic security first, right? I mean, to embark on a low carbon pathway of renewable energies, of cutting out the dependence on fossil fuels, all of this takes financing. All of this takes capacity. There's a reason why developed countries are more able to use renewable energies and develop the kind of green technologies. So this is why when we talk about means of implementation, we highlight that capacity building and technological development and technology transfer is a huge element in order to address the gap between rich countries being able to, use all the green technology they want in developing countries not having the money to develop or access or afford green technologies, especially when they are kept very expensive through intellectual property rights and patent laws and all of that. So all of this connects with sustainable development. Sustainable development is economic, social, and environmental. And the reason why we're talking about common but differentiated responsibility and human rights is because the environment part is not going to be possible without the economic part first. We need basic economic security and a development pathway in order to become sustainable. You can't have sustainability in poverty. That would be sustainable poverty, which is the opposite of sustainable development. So that's why what is being asserted is that all three pillars are equal, but the economic has to be it has to be secured before the environmental. And for this, we need to take out the idea that the economic means fossil fuels, economic means pollution. The economic doesn't necessarily mean pollution and fossil fuels if we can harness the kind of technology transfer needed to make sure that it's renewable and clean technologies that drive the economic process.
Yeah, thanks, Bhumika. This is a great answer, and I completely agree with you. And just to share, just from the women's rights groups who have been advocating at the UN, at the regional levels, at the national levels, we don't want just a new development agenda. What we really pushing for is sustainable development agenda, as Bhumika has explained, and the interlinkage between these issues. So for us, like a human rights-based approach, a justice approach, gender equality approach would include addressing all the three pillars of sustainable development, that you can't have one without the other. And that's something that's very clear from the groups that we have been working with. For the Women's Major Group, which is the main vehicle for many women's groups engaged in sustainable development agenda discussions. So that's not, it's funny because sometimes when I am thinking about these issues, I never think about development. My thought is towards sustainable development, especially because of the point that Bhumika said, if we don't address this, then we have sustainable poverty, and it's not what we want. So, overall, the discussions that we have been engaged in and pushing for is precisely sustainable development and addressing the three pillars of sustainable development. It's really unfortunate that I know a lot of people are losing because we are at the time already, and we did have other questions to address, but we have a few things to go through. So at this moment, I would just like to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you. Thanks to Bhumika and to Bridget for sharing with us their knowledge and experiences in these issues. We had some sort of, we have just final closing that Leila's going to walk us through. So I'm just going to give her the mic now. And thank you so much. It was really interesting, and I'm looking forward to hear more from you. And maybe what we can do is send you guys these questions through our evaluation. You can share with us some of the strategies happening at the national and local level, and we can also learn from you while we're doing our international advocacy. But let me give the mic to Leila, who can close the session for us.
Hi, so thank you everyone again for joining us. Just before you leave, a few closing remarks. Also thanks to our special guest today. We have put on a link for the evaluation, which would be amazing if you could fill out after the session. It really helps us for further sessions and also an improvement and your organization, so that would be great. Also keep checking the Young Feminist Wire. There are also a blog series which the Wire produced for the CSW. There have been 6 blogs published on the Wire by young women who either attended the CSW or have written about it with regards to different issues. Yes, so don't forget the evaluation, and thank you so much for joining us again today. And in case you have any comments or related comments, you can always write to membership@awid.org.
Thank you so so much, everyone, and we'll make the session available. It has been recorded, so once we have it set up, we can share the link so that you guys can follow, can go back to listen or raise questions or share with others, so we'll let you know how that goes. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll keep you posted on our next activity.
You had it recorded on audio, is that right, Marissa?
Yes, it's being recorded. Sorry, we weren't. Initially, the discussion wasn't there, so we can talk about it. How to share.
Okay.